Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Gorley, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in today for another episode of the Injury Prevention Academy, a podcast brought to you by DORN Companies, the country's leading wellness-based pain management and injury prevention company. DORN is committed to reducing costs of healthcare and workers' compensation, as well as reducing lost productivity, which has resulted in over $120 million in savings over the last 20 years for our clients. Joining us today is Dr. Stephen Simon. Dr. Simon is the originator of the concept of safety culture. In 1983, he coined the phrase and developed a successful methodology for implementing culture-based strategies that improve safety performance. With mastery in the science of organizational behavior and adroit in navigating the complexities of organizational change, Dr. Simon continues to blaze a trail in what is now the international movement of safety culture optimization. Welcome, Simon.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Good to be here.
Absolutely, and I really look forward to just hearing your insight and your experience in safety, because it's such an integral part of the workforce today.
Sure is. Yep.
Yeah, it is. Now, you're frequently called the father of safety culture. What led to your focus on workplace safety?
Well, it's a great question because as an organizational psychologist, I worked with different organizations and fell into safety the way people often do in a career, which is pretty much by chance. A friend of mine was selling safety awards to companies, and the plant manager said to her, "We have deeper motivational problems that are going to be solved by providing someone with a ball cap and a logo on it. Do you happen to know any motivational psychologists?" And she asked me if I'd ever done work in the field, and I had read a book on corporate culture, and I had done work in therapeutic communities. The therapeutic community idea for substance abuse is to take, provide a place for individuals to go get themselves cleaned up and then learn how to live a productive life. As folks know, it was a revolution because it didn't focus on the individual in the doctor's office. It focused on the impact of community. And I realized they were successful as anti-addiction communities, and it struck me. And anti-addiction cultures. What about an anti-accident culture? And came up with the idea of that would be a safety culture, and where the culture of the organization, in our case, manufacturing and service, and the public-private sector, could have an impact on individuals. And so I went out. That was 1983. I got started. Found. Up until that time, safety was pretty much the 3 E's. It was engineering, enforcement, and education. You identify the hazard, you engineer it out, you create a policy, you enforce it, you train or educate employees on how to follow the policy. And there was a little bit of behavior focus, but I felt that the focus on behavior, and what later came to be known behavior-based safety, it was really too much aimed at the individual, and that behavior change without culture change doesn't last. So, I created a methodology, started speaking to the National Safety Council, American Society of Safety Engineers, and so on and so forth, and the whole concept, and got really good results by focusing on the culture of the organization as applied to modifying individuals' unsafe habits and behaviors, and the rest is kind of history. That's how it got started.
Absolutely, and I think the differences in how different companies actually approach safety, I'm sure has just dramatically changed over the last couple of decades. And you've worked with different companies like Harley Davidson, GE, Thermo Fisher, Toyota. What are those differences that you've seen in really how companies address safety?
I mean, it's a great question. When you look at the way things were 20, 30 years ago until now, that's how did companies address safety back then? it was pretty much all on the physical side. You do inspections and so on and so forth. And now so much of it is focusing on behavior and culture and leadership as well. That's a huge change. I think the way I think of it is there's kind of a maturity path that companies go through. And back in the 80s, it was just establishing safety as a value. And, the slogan's up on the wall: safety's first, safety's number one. Whether it was or not, it was establishing the value, including in many annual reports and mission statements and so on. Then it moved in the 90s much more to working with leadership and realizing that the shadow that leaders cast impacts employee behavior. And I think, our focus at Culture Change Consultants has always been then to move to the grassroots, so it's not only top down but bottom up as well. Because once again, for change to be sustainable and really to reach the peer groups, it has to be driven by the peer groups. So different industries kind of came onto that maturity scale at different times. But I would say it's not, from my experience, others may have different experience. It's not so much the difference in industries as the difference in individual companies. So GE was a leader in manufacturing all the way back in the 80s. They're a company like Thermo Fisher, leadership in the pharmaceutical side. General Motors was first in the auto space. And then other companies kind of came along following these leaders. And now, in 2021, most Fortune 500, companies have very, very good safety commitment and safety programs, and the lacks are much more in the kind of cracks in the are much more that they have to fill in are much more in the culture than it is on the program side.
Okay, and so when you're looking at the different organizations like Harley Davidson, like GE, like General Motors that you mentioned, is there a difference in really how they approach it in terms of their actual industry, like you said, or is it very much just establishing something that works for all?
I think that when you mention those companies in particular, another dividing point has to do with whether it's a union facility or whether it's not. I think there are differences when you have. So I was fortunate enough to be the lead consultant for General Motors on its global safety culture change effort. And at the very beginning, we got the union involved, and that was the key. Too many companies begin their safety culture journeys with management only, or sometimes a safety department only. And creating a safety culture has to be a partnership effort. And in a union site, in some ways it's easier because the union has as part of a key part of its mandate to provide a safe workplace. And sure, there are differences between union and management. They fight sometimes in some instances. But I have seen much greater partnerships now than I did before. So I think that that's a huge split in terms of how companies approach. Otherwise, in non-union sites, I guess what I've seen is that it's either the safety department that drives the change, or if you happen to have one or two leaders, operations leaders, that have become passionate and are strongly committed to safety, then they will. But it's not. It takes a while to reach the partnership level.
Absolutely. And I think you see a lot of that change happening especially over the last couple of years, when now employees are either working virtually or it's very removed from different people, be it space or be it companies that have multiple locations, how I'm sure that the focus on workplace safety, even just within a physical scope, has changed, but even over a mental kind of well-being scope. DORN recently held a wellness think tank with 30 wellness directors, and mental health was just a very large part of their focus for 2022 and beyond. Is that something that you've seen as well?
Yeah, that's terrific. I think particularly because of the pandemic, That's exactly something that I've seen. You know, I'm sure like DORN, we had to shift almost our entire business model to go virtual starting in March 2020 when a whole number of our clients just went into hibernation, you know, so, and understandably, you can't do anything in person. And virtually, a lot of what we heard in focus groups and safety culture assessments, you know, was the stresses and strains of working from home. And a lot of times the polarization, we work with a lot of utilities where the line workers, the electricians and the gas service reps, they're out in the field, but supervision and management are sitting at home. And, you know, created some real tension. But for the folks at home, as I'm sure you've discovered, you know, there are mental health and life work balance issues that come up from being virtual that did not exist before. You know, when do I stop work at the end of the day? Why am I receiving telephone calls at 10 at night? You know, why isn't my company setting these limits? And you know, the stress of having to do it all. So yeah, I think I also have seen an increase in focus on wellness and just a more holistic view that physical and mental health all impact safety.
Absolutely. And how different companies can approach that with their employees, you know, having them understand that like the senior leadership understands kind of some of the stresses that come with being virtual, that come from being away from a typical work environment, I think is huge and has really come into focus now.
Totally agree.
Yeah. Now, while working with General Motors, they were actually able to reduce their injury and illness rate by 95% while they reshaped their culture over a 10-year period, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, that's a complete 180 shift from a typical environment. What were the hurdles faced when you were working with employees with those ingrained work habits? Because I know that we really saw that even, you know, how you've said over the pandemic of people learning how to manage those changes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to impacting ingrained work habits in old line companies that have been around for 50, 75, or 100 years, you know, like General Motors,
right,
and are lucky enough to have tenured employees with, you know, high skill sets, but who learn their safety habits back in the day before safety was quite as important as it is now. I think the key is to recognize that the safety culture change has to be top down and bottom up at the same time, that you're not done just because you finish working with leadership. In the case of General Motors, I mean, it's a fascinating project for me. You know, Paul O'Neill, who's a legend now in the safety world, he used to be the chairman of Alcoa. He visited General Motors. He joined the board of directors, and he asked the board, how are we doing in safety performance? And they looked and discovered they'd had, you know, about 4 fatalities a year from 1970s until 1990s. And he said, you know, we can do better. And to their credit, they, you know, did some benchmarking and had folks from Alcoa come over who discovered that the only difference between General Motors and Alcoa was world-class safety, they said, was that we at Alcoa don't reach into machines while they're moving, and you do reach into machines while you're moving at General Motors. We have the culture and leadership. You have a lot of great, you know, 4-color brochure programs. And they set out to work to develop the culture. And I was invited in to speak to the, you know, heads of manufacturing at General Motors. I had 1 hour to do it. And the only point I made was that you've worked for 100 years on the 3 E's, you know, the engineering, enforcement, and education. And you haven't, but you don't work the culture. You got to start working the culture. And they were very open to it. We went off site for a day. They, you know, really looked at their own behavior first as executives when it came to safety. And I remember the head of the trucking division said, every Monday I call in to my 5 truck manufacturing plants. Each one has thousands of people. And I asked the plant manager 2 questions. how many trucks did we manufacture last week and what was our quality score? He said, I have never in my 20-year tenure in this position asked how many people did we hurt. And he said, I can see, why we have the culture that we have. And they set out to change it. And but so that was top down. But the reason it took 10 years is they acknowledged and understood, and they were partnering with the union, that they had to get into every one of their 160 plants at the time and really begin to work from the grassroots up. So to me, when it comes to ingrained work habits, it's really working on the floor, with the folks that are at the greatest risk, the workers who require the support and commitment for leadership, but it's not just a leadership intervention.
Right, and working with those employees, whether it's out on the floor, whether it's getting them information in terms of what they can do when different situations arise, I think is so important when you're really talking with, say, like a broad group of people out on a floor. It's not just the workers with ingrained work habits. Sometimes it's someone being trained where they've never had to deal with some of the machinery. Did you see a difference in how kind of the injury prevention and safety was approached when you're working with kind of a multi-generational workforce?
It's interesting. I think what I've seen with that is it does depend so much on the industry. So take the utilities, for example. I mean, utilities, if you're going to be an electric line worker, you go to apprentice school, and it takes you years to become a journeyman. So there's a built-in not only training program but effort at inculcating a safety mindset, from the company to newer workers. Now, if you ask, some of the older timers, in utilities across the country, they'll say something that I think is just great. The more enlightened ones will say, these new kids, they're a different generation. They didn't grow up working on cars. They're not real good with their hands yet, and mostly they want to, get off at the end of the day and, either go to the beach or go to the bar, whatever it happens to be. But then the more enlightened ones say, but when I really think about it, I was that way too when I was 20, and so on. And the less enlightened ones, say it's almost impossible to train them. Having said that, I think the utilities do a great job because it's built in. I think what I've seen in other companies where it's not built in, they just bring in a new hire, they give them a one-day orientation to the company, they throw them out there, into the workplace. There's a lot of different challenges that really end up focusing around communication between the younger generation and the folks that have been doing the job for a long time, and not even to mention the supervisors.
Right, and I think communication is such a large part of that, and also really striving for retention. That's ultimately what you want to see within a safety program and safety culture, because you can give them the information and the tools that they need, but employees ultimately have to be utilizing that over extended periods of time.
Yeah, exactly. And we've all been reading in the paper in the last few months about retention and the great drawdown of people after COVID. So many people just leaving their jobs, and in many instances starting out on their own. So retention, I think, now it's never been more important. And I would agree with you that to the degree to which the workplace the company makes the workplace a great place to work where folks want to be in, that's obviously going to positively impact the retention. Right.
And now you recently wrote just this great article entitled "Creating a Work Culture of Psychological Safety, Making It Safe to Speak Up." Now, what is psychological safety, and why is it so important when you're creating a safe culture within an organization?
So psychological safety. Here's my thoughts on psychological safety, and I have real thoughts about it, because I'll explain why. So I think psychological safety is a term describes something that's always been around in good safety programs and in good safety cultures. And it means that information flows, employees feel safe to speak up. Basically, it's a safety to speak up about concerns, about ideas for improvement, about things that you think are wrong, things that you think are unsafe. So we all know that has had different names through the years. I think one of the great things about psychological safety is it's a concept that's caught on right now. I think it's an idea whose time has come. It was really started by Professor Amy Edmondson at Harvard, who's written some great books on it, did a great TED Talk on it, and talks about the willingness to take, or the feeling of confidence to take an interpersonal risk when you're on a team or when you're in a group and to say something. Okay, now, the National Safety Council, I believe it was last week, it's a week right before Thanksgiving, held its first ever psychological safety summit. And it was a virtual all day. I mean, I was honored to be on the opening panel for that and talk about the history of psychological safety. And the idea that the council has put it in its focus by devoting an entire virtual conference, psychological safety conference, and they have a research branch now that's working on it, and have talked about its connection to safety. I think really is super important. So from the standpoint of my work over the last 30 years in safety culture, I have always emphasized the establishing of grassroots safety culture teams, where folks who are doing the work do have a forum to talk with each other and with management about the problems that they see. And what we've seen in that is by providing that voice to union or non-union employees, they do identify problems, safety problems. They do come up with solutions. They do implement those solutions. So it is something I feel we've been doing for decades. But the great thing about psychological safety is everybody working in the safety field, it's been branded now. And you can go, I get telephone calls from people. I mean, I just finished a psychological safety culture assessment for a major Washington, D.C. U.S. government branch. So they were so interested in psychological safety that they said, we want to know where our employees are, what their perceptions are, what their culture is, with respect to the feeling of speaking up. Do they feel confident? Do they think there'll be retaliation, and so on and so forth? So I think that for those of us who worked in safety field for a long time, on one hand, there's nothing new about it. On the other hand, it's a great opportunity, a window of opportunity, because management who may not know that much about the innards of the safety program are now saying to safety managers, hey, I hear about this psychological safety thing. Are we doing that? And if not, it's just like it was with BBS. It's just like it was with safety culture in the back in the day. And now this is the newest thing. But but it doesn't have to be a fad. It can be something like emotional intelligence. At one point was a fad. Now everybody does it. It's built in. It's not a fad. And I think that's what's happening with psychological safety. So I think it's very important part of a safety culture, critical part.
Now you mentioned the idea of kind of a grassroots part of psychological safety. When I think of grassroots, I really think of almost outside of the structured norm, kind of coming in and presenting new ideas. Is that what you've seen in terms of employees now understanding that it's okay to speak up and really point out some of the current issues that are being seen?
Yeah, I think in some companies that's what happens. And I know one utility actually has a speak up culture program. Okay. And yes, people not on any given team, that makes them feel confident that they can come in and present their ideas. I think the other thing I am talking about, though, Catherine, is more of a structured grassroots effort where there are specific teams that made up of frontline workers that know that safety department management want to hear their ideas, and then they come forward with them, and they you know, including you know, and anything having to do with safety and health, and that they do feel their ideas are welcomed. And look, I remember I remember working at the Toyota plant outside of St. Louis, and this plant manager was Charlie. He was fabulous. He was so committed to safety. He could not understand why his line workers would reach into the line when it was moving. Okay, and he did everything to try to get him to stop that. And he was really committed. He was passionate about safety. And so we put together a grassroots team and said, "What do you guys think?" And they took a look at it. And they came back to Charlie and said, "Here's what we think. There's actually 55 e-stops on this line. And, you know, none of our employees know there's 55 ways to stop this line. So, yeah, they see the production line going, they just jump on it because they know you want production. But we're going to do some training with them. We're going to walk them around the line. We're going to show them all 55 e-stops. We'll solve your problem for you, Charlie." And they did. And I remember when Charlie was, you know, talking about this in the town hall, he was crying. And he said, "I now get it. There are problems that management can't fix because management doesn't even see it. And by empowering the workforce, you know, in this case, I can't thank you guys enough. You know, you're helping everybody's safety, and we finally, people are not, you know, jumping on the line to remove a part or spare part. I mean, so grassroots really, you know, that's just the reality. There are many issues that that only folks in the front line see, and only they can fix.
Right, and I think the idea of psychological safety really calls to mind DORN's philosophy that we call engagement through education and empowerment. And it really is about creating a culture where the employees are able to communicate kind of where those current issues are, but also using that knowledge to create data and to create actually a program that they can really have those changes happen. You know, now you mentioned kind of how sometimes the supervisors or the management isn't especially, you know, possibly aware that certain current issues are occurring. You know, how can safety managers engage their senior management in creating those injury prevention and wellness programs?
So I think when it comes to senior management, the first thing that safety managers really do need to do is identify whether the senior managers they want to influence are already committed to safety, or whether they're neutral, or whether they're just oppositional. Okay, because you got to approach each one of those differently. If they're already committed to safety, then it's obviously a lot easier and you know, to introduce really good programs to them. And always look, the most valuable asset to a safety manager that a senior manager has is the senior manager's calendar. And to get them or to speak to their admin or whatever, to get 10 minutes, 20 minutes of their time on some regular basis by getting on their calendar and having them come down to the floor, or having them see what, you know, take the time to see the program. I think with senior managers who get it, it's pretty easy. I think with senior managers who are neutral, that the best way to get them engaged in safety programs is actually to introduce them to peer companies and send them out on a benchmark. And I've seen numerous, you know, senior vice presidents of supply chain or senior vice presidents of manufacturing or plant managers just, you know, have those aha, you know, conversions by going and seeing somebody, and not always even in the same industry, but a CEO somewhere, you know, who has transformed their safety culture. And it gives, you know, the manager who's kind of in between, you know, they're neutral, you know, the belief that they can do it. So I think for them, that's the way it works. For oppositional, the only for the senior leaders that are oppositional, honestly, the only thing I've ever seen that work, and there may be other things too, is the hard business case of the cost. That having accidents, you know, on employees who are, you know, on workers' comp, and then what can happen if you implement this the safety. Sad to say, but that I have seen that work, and I haven't seen a lot of other things work. But look, I do think back to your earlier question that most senior managers these days, in well-run, USA companies, they understand about safety, and they care about the employees, and they care, and so it's much more a matter of how do you introduce to them, a new idea, or and possibly getting into benchmark.
I think absolutely the data that senior management can be provided in terms of, like you said, work comp costs. I mean, that's going to snowball if you don't have those safety programs in place, if you don't have that culture that's actively trying to make sure that the like we said, the workers with ingrained work habits are being seen, but also the new hires. How is your orientation working? How are you training your new employees so that these work comp costs are not happening in the first place? And creating that communication, I think, is so important in those variety of different industries.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. The communicating right across all of those aspects of a safety program you just mentioned. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, in a recent article, you described workplace safety with safety programs being the meat and potatoes and safety culture being the broth, which which I really love that, because I think everyone can see that. Now that's something physical that they can imagine. Now, expand on that if you could, of just how you can see that working and having people actually see that within their organizations.
Yeah, at Coach and Change Consultants, we call that the stew in the broth analogy. Okay, and here's how this came about.
Yeah.
So look, when I started talking at National Safety Council, the early '80s, about safety culture, people used to say, "Why are you putting the word safety and culture in the same sentence? Where are you getting these ideas? Are you sitting in a hot tub in California and eating, sandwiches of alfalfa sprouts? And what are you smoking? I mean, the word culture had no place in the safety field." And I realized that I had to come up with some analogies, some language. Culture is so much a part of language that people would be able to understand why we're talking about culture, and we're not just talking about the traditional thing of safety programs. And the analogy we came up with was that safety programs can be likened to the solid ingredients in a safety stew, or a pot of stew on the stove. And you got to have good safety programs. So your incident investigation program, your PPE, your safety meetings, that's your that's your meat and potatoes. And you don't just want a regular incident investigation like old hamburger meat. You want a really good one, like good sirloin. Okay, so and companies spend a lot of time on because that's what compliance and OSHA looks at the safety programs. So they look at the meat and potatoes. But the part of this analogy that works is that meat and potatoes sit in something, in a stew, and what they sit in is the liquid. They sit in a broth, and the culture is the broth. So a positive, wholesome, healthy culture broth. The ingredients in there are responsiveness and commitment, and psychological safety and good leadership, and so on. The unhealthy nutrients, or the negative broth, or it could be the rancid broth, is the focus on numbers over people. It's never getting back when somebody brings in a safety concern. It's mistrust in the culture, mistrust in the broth. It's double standards and production over safety. So those kinds of things. So you can have the best sirloin, but if it's sitting in a rancid broth, you throw your sewer. And the analogy there is, most companies spend 90% of their time and 90% of their dollars on the meat and potatoes. They go to the grocer and they get great safety programs. But if the culture isn't healthy, you're not going to get much out of your safety program. So you got an incident investigation program, and Steve has an accident, and Catherine, my supervisor, comes up to me, and it's a healthy broth, a good culture. And hey, Steve, what happened? We want to learn, and I'm going to tell you what happened, and you're going to get it out, and other people, so they don't get hurt. but you
Mhm.
move to the same safety program, incident investigation, same supervisor, Captain. We now move to a different company, and you say, "Hey, Steve, you're having another accident. My numbers are terrible. I can't believe you're getting hurt. Tell me what happened." And what Steve's going to do in that kind of a rancid broth and negative safety culture, Steve's going to say, "Wait a minute, Captain, I'm going to call on my shop steward. I'm not telling you what happened because there's going to be punishment, retaliation, discipline, a letter in my file or worse." So it's the
Right.
same program, the same meat and potato, and a different broth. And I guess the final point on this is the reason we found this language to be so helpful is really for senior management, because the creation of the meat and the potatoes is the safety department responsibility. And I hear a lot of senior managers say, "Well, yeah, but safety's not mine. I hired you to get this for me." But the broth is the senior managers. They create the culture. And once they get that concept, you can engage them very, very heavily into the safety world from the culture standpoint. They're being leaders of the culture, not from the compliance, running the safety program part. So thanks for asking that question. We're proud of the meeting of the stew and the broth analogy. I think it helps. It's helped a lot of companies to understand that culture and programs go together, but they're different. And culture does get run by the operations side.
Absolutely. And knowing that communication is such a large part of safety. It's telling, an employee this is the proper way to move to improve their body mechanics, but it's also, like you said, that communication between management, supervisors, and say the workers out on the floor, understanding where those current issues are, how things can be improved. That's so much of building within an organization, everything from productivity to retention of employees. Employees will stay at a company much longer if they feel like they're being seen by a company, if they feel like they're being taken care of. And it's really exciting to see that growth within different organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm.
Now, when you think of, I'd say, true safety and injury prevention, what are the three fundamental ideas or building blocks that companies need to keep in mind when they're looking to create those safety cultures?
So, okay, what are three really fundamental building blocks? I think that I think that first, companies need to realize that for the last 100 years, traditional safety has worked around safety programs in the three E's: engineering, enforcement. And those were the three pillars. Okay, that's traditional safety. That's compliance. That's what OSHA. Culture is different from compliance. So understanding that work in the culture, I guess, needs to be as intense as work in the programs is the first. If you're going to work the culture, you gotta know what it is and realize that its impact is just as important. And in many cases, because so many companies now have excellent safety programs, they're not going to get much more margin of benefit out of working another program. They got to really focus on the culture. I would say focus on the culture is number one. Number two, second building block in building a culture is to realize that from a culture standpoint, leadership means all levels. It is not synonymous with management, and that all constituents, all members of the organization need to be engaged in moving forward, both with their ideas and their commitment. And which takes time, but you can't just do it top down. You can't just do it management only. So I think the second building block is spending the time at the grassroots and supervisor. We haven't talked too much about that, but obviously at the admin management supervisor levels as well. So I would say that's the second building block. And I guess I think the third is Yeah, I think the third is to recognize that establishing, building, sustaining a safety culture is really a journey. It's not a program. There may be different processes, but it's really a journey. And I'll never forget. I mean, just this wonderful experience that made this point so great. I was on a Friday afternoon once talking in a GE plant, and the GE, plant manager at the end of a couple-hour workshop on safety culture. This was, back a while. I turned to a safety manager and said, "I love this safety culture stuff. Get me one of those by Monday morning." Okay, and that is in contrast to I had the privilege of presenting to the global head of safety for Toyota in America, in Kentucky, at the big plant there, and the safety guys took me out to dinner the night before. Said, "Have you ever presented to a Japanese executive?" I said, "No." And they said, "Here's the thing. He's going to be there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and he's going to sit there with his eyes closed. Don't take it personally. He's listening." I said, "Okay." And don't ask him if he's listening. It's a loss of face. And don't ask if he understands the English. He's got a translator sitting next to him, but he speaks English just fine. Okay, so we're going along. About 15 minutes into my presentation, I say, yeah, and the thing about building safety culture is, I guess we found it's 5 to 7 years in a single plant, 7 to 10 years in a business unit, and probably 10 to 20 in a in a full organization, full company. And you can kind of measure it by if the current leadership leaves, are all the new habits, all the new norms still there? And at that point, this head of global safety for Toyota, he went like this, his eyes were closed, he went, "No rush." And I remember thinking, you got the GE guy, get me one of those safety cultures by Monday morning. And then you got Toyota, that I remember thinking, they really do think like an 150-year time frame, the way they're reputed to. And they, of course, the Toyota production system and the Toyota way are culture, and this, culture ways they run their company. So I think the third thing is have a lot of patience when you're building a safety culture. Realize it's a journey, and it's not a destination. And just like you're working on the other parts of your safety programs, you're always working on the part assessing and improving your safety culture. So that's my third.
No, that's great, because I think having organizations understand that it is not that overnight phenomena of, oh, absolutely, here's safety, just go and do that. It really is about, like you said, creating that culture, creating that understanding and communication, and ultimately, kind of the way you said, Toyota thinks in 100, 150 years, that's going to make your business last as long as it can because of that safety culture.
Exactly. And, I think, I've always had that point of view, and my team and I at Culture Change Consultants, I think the thing we're proudest of is we actually have clients that have been on the journey for 29 years, 25 years, 21 years. There are, major companies that work for years and get the results, in part because they got the concept that, building your culture is worthwhile, and, it takes a lot of time and commitment, but you get the results.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Simon, so much for joining me today. This was really great. It's so important in organizations to create that culture, and it's exciting to hear just the different mindsets that you've seen and how you've worked through those different mindsets.
Well, thank you, Catherine. I've enjoyed. You're a great interviewer, and I've enjoyed it's more of a conversation. I've enjoyed the conversation. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for joining DORN's Injury Prevention Academy. Tune in next time to learn more about the innovative steps and programs taking place in today's world of safety.